Hello. Today I'd like to, well, at least briefly cover a very complex subject, and that is problems with audio and videotapes, and why they may not play, and what can and cannot be done to solve some of the problems that you may come across. So, audio and videotapes can suffer from problems which may be something we can resolve, or at least partially resolve, or in some cases, not really. And one of the unfortunate things is that some people believe there's a simple fix to everything. It's well known that some tapes can benefit from a baking process, and I do carry out tape baking here, and I'll show you the equipment. But that is not the solution for everything. Some tapes require different handling depending what their problems are. So I've thought of 5 categories of problems here, and you may have ideas of others, but 5 basic categories of the kind of problems that you might get with an audio or videotape. The first one is what is known as sticky shed syndrome, and there's kind of 2 sides to that. One is the tape can be sticky, and the other is that it can shed oxide typically. So certain tapes are very known for this problem, and what will happen is if you try to play a tape like this as an audio tape, if you try to play this Ampex branded audio tape on a tape recorder, what will happen is either it'll start playing fine, but then the sound will quickly go muffled as the tape material comes off the tape and starts to clog the heads of the player, or you'll get problems with the tape running very slow or squealing as it goes through the machine because it's sticky and it's sticking to the tape path of the machine. So that's sticky shed syndrome. Doesn't just apply to Ampex branded tapes. Another problem is mould. Now, mould can build up typically on tapes that have been stored in the damp. So if you've had tapes stored in a loft, you'll get a mould build-up, so you get a grey or white sort of powder on the top of the tape. Now, with something like a VHS tape, that may not be too serious, because you may be able to just play the tape, perhaps in an old gash machine, and as the tape winds its way through the machine, it'll peel off the top and bottom surfaces of the tape. And provided there's not too much mould growth across the tape surface, the results may be more or less fine. But there are some provisos there. One is that if the tape's extremely mouldy, the sort of tendrils of the mould can go right across the tape surface, in which case you'll get massive amounts of dropouts, and you can get what looks like sticky shed syndrome in that the heads keep clogging on the player. So that can affect even a large format tape like VHS, Beta, U-matic, that in an extreme case, it will ruin the picture and sound. And sound can be particularly affected on hi-fi tapes. But it can be worse than that. On some formats of tape, the tape itself inside the cassette is very thin because it's designed to fit in a small tape. So if these go mouldy, it's really bad. The mould is stronger than the tape, and it will cause it to snap. And I've done a video which goes into some detail on how I've worked on a solution to demould video 8 tapes in particular that can suffer from this problem. And I have a fairly good success rate on that. It's a time-consuming process, takes hours, I have to charge some considerable fee for that. It's also rather hazardous for health. But in all the years I've now been demoulding video 8 tapes, I think I've had one I've had to give up on. So it can do the job, but it's unpleasant. Now, a sort of extension to that is if you've had a tape which is, I've had one in the past, which was actually submerged in water due to a flood. And I've covered one of those in a video before. So it's not only got sticky shed, but also mould. And even when you've done all those, it still won't play very well. So, or really at all. And for that, you may need to put the tape, after clearing the mould, you may need to put the tape through some kind of tape polishing process. and I can show you how I do that here, and also I've sent tapes away to somebody who has a machine called a tape check machine, especially designed for cleaning tape surfaces. A third problem can be low RF or low signal recorded on the tape. Certain brands of tape are particularly known to that, such as, in fact, I've found certain Scotch 3M tapes, particularly on the U-matic format. They self-erase. They don't have good magnetic retentivity. So the tape recording may have been fine when it was made, but some decades later you go to play it, and if you have an RF meter on your player, as some professional machines do, you'll see a very low reading, and you finish up with an effect that looks similar to worn heads, little streaks coming off transitions between bright and dark objects. And it can be, in extreme cases, just unwatchable. It can be just unusable. It could also defeat the dropout compensator of the player, so any dropouts really look really bad. I really would not like to say again that Scotch 3M are the only tapes that suffer from poor magnetic retentivity, but it's a particular concern on those in the case of low band tapes such as U-matic tapes. But actually I've also found that in general SVHS tapes are more susceptible to magnetic retentivity problems than regular VHS, and similarly high 8 tapes are more susceptible to the same problems than regular video 8 tapes. And furthermore, I've found that high 8 tapes are more susceptible to sticky shed syndrome, particularly the sticky side of it, where the tapes will squeal through a player, than regular video 8 tapes. So that's low RF signal or low audio signal in the case of an audio tape. So another problem can be tape damage, and I've covered this in a previous video, for example on video 8 tapes, where if this is played through a machine which has a bad pinch roller, the tape can ride up on the capstan and hit the top of the mechanism as it's going through, and it'll put a fold in the tape. And similar things can happen to VHS as well, and beta. And a particular problem with VHS and beta is that the control pulses that allow the tracking to work are stored on one edge of the tape. And if that edge of the tape is crumpled, then you can finish up with a tape that's almost impossible to play. There is actually sometimes a workaround for that. There's one or two machines that can play tapes which don't have a control signal. But generally speaking, once you've lost that control signal, you'll finish up with problems with picture rolling because you can't get a tracking signal. So there can be other kinds of tape damage too, but folding of the tape is a particular problem. You can also get cases where it's crumpled all the way as long as length, and it's pretty much lost at that point. And of course there's another category of bad recordings, or bad tapes, which is bad recordings. So in fact one of these suffers from just that. There's a tape here which looks like a normal tape, but actually what's happened is someone had a NTSC VHS tape and tried to copy it onto a PAL VHS machine and never checked what they'd got. So they probably saw a perfectly good picture on the monitor, hit play on their machine, hit record on the recorder, and thought they'd get a copy of the tape. And no, it doesn't work. You can't do that. There can be other occasions where a recording is defective as well. For example, if you've had a head clog during recording, you get an effect that looks like the old sticky shed thing where your heads keep clogging, but what's actually going on is the heads of the player are fine, but the recording was lost on one head. And occasionally something can be done about that. If you've got a very stable playback with one good frame and one non-existent frame, you can use video editing software to pick out the good frames. But generally speaking, if you've got a clogged head during recording, it's probably a lost recording. And there are other things that can go wrong at record time as well, of course. A particular problem can be long play recordings. People would record their most precious memories on VHS long play, not realizing that VHS long play is not guaranteed to play on any machine apart from the one that recorded it. It's designed as a throwaway format, and sometimes a long play recording is totally unplayable on any other machine. Okay, having identified what I believe are the 5 main categories of problems you can get with tapes, what can we do about some of those? Let's start with sticky shed syndrome. If there's one brand name that strikes fear into the heart of anyone who works in audio video equipment, it's Ampex. You know you're in trouble when you see the Ampex brand name. And it was very often used on audio tapes, but also on some video as well. And you just know you're in for sticky shed trouble. But Ampex did realise they'd had a problem with some of their tape formulations and actually released a paper on how to overcome the problem, and that's where the whole tape baking idea came from. So what I have here is a very slightly modified Heraeus scientific oven. This one's set to run at 50 Celsius, and I've added fans at the bottom, so I've got a USB or 5 volt power supply built into it to run these fans, and also a temperature readout. And I can put tapes in there for, well, I would normally start with maybe 5 hours, and if that doesn't solve the problems, anything up to 24, 48 hours, or even several days in extreme cases. And it can stabilize the tape enough to at least make it playable, maybe for 1 or 2 passes. So you can go from a tape that's completely unplayable to something that you can have a go at playing without fouling up your machine too badly. These 10.5-inch spools, being quite bulky, they do somewhat fill my machine, and I have to move the shelves around. But if you wanted to do this yourself and you don't have a scientific oven or an incubator, actually a good fan-assisted domestic electric oven, perhaps set up a thermometer so you can keep an eye on the temperature, set it to 50 Celsius, bake the tapes for maybe half a day or so, and there's a fighting chance that sticky tapes will be a lot better. There's a range of machines called Tape Check. They're made in America, and they are designed to polish various different formats of tapes. I don't have one of those. I have sent some tapes off to be polished in this way, and it can help. What I do have is my own Heath Robinson contraption. This horrible Heath Robinson contraption is often used for demoulding Video 8 tapes, but so I can put very low torque on here and pull tape mould off a Video 8 tape that's sat on there. But it also has here we have an old VHS erase head, and sat next to it is a sapphire edge, a sapphire block, which has been taken from a scrap Betacam machine. And if you run the tape in this direction over that edge there, it can burnish the tape and stop it from being such a sticky and tape shedding effect. And if you run a tape through this a few times, it can have the effect of making a tape playable. It's not something I enjoy doing, it's very time consuming, but for some formats there's very little choice. So that's sticky shed tapes, which can improve with baking and or polishing. Now mould is my second category here. Look at the state of this VHS tape. It's clearly been stored somewhere very damp for a long time, and mould has built up on it. Now I've done a video which I'll link to here, where you can see how I demould Video 8 tapes in particular. Other formats can be even harder than Video 8. I've had a DAT tape in once that was mouldy, and because there are no flanges on the tape on that one, I had no way of winding that safely onto another spool and back again, and I really just could not demould it. It was just going to snap all over the place. Snapping is a particular problem with mouldy Video 8 tapes, as well as clearing mould here. I also have 8mm splicing blocks and splicing tape, so that if they do snap I can repair them properly. So far, have very few DV tapes that are mouldy, which may just be chance, maybe because they're newer. It might be because they have better tape formulations. And it's worth mentioning one brand again. There's always a brand that gets it wrong. One brand I found that's particularly susceptible to mould on metal tape formulations, so primarily Video 8 High 8, but also Betacam SP and an obscure professional format called M2, is Fuji. If ever there's a collection of tapes that are going to be mouldy, it's going to be the Fuji ones more than Sony, for example. Something to do with the tape formulation they used. If tapes have been submerged, then the mould is kind of not the only problem. You can have a situation where the tape is really degraded badly and tape baking still isn't enough. And well, I have sent in one case a tape off to be run through a tape check machine. It was a Betamax tape, and I loaded it into a VHS shell just so that it would fit into a VHS tape check machine. And that polished the tape several times, and it was still pretty rough. But at least there was something recoverable from that tape, otherwise it would have been a complete dead loss. Now, low magnetic retentivity, or low RF in the case of a videotape, is a problem which I found applies primarily to pneumatic tapes, primarily to Scotch 3M branded ones, but not only. And what can you do about it? Well, you can try to squeeze a little bit more signal out of it. I find there's actually a control on pneumatic machines labelled skew, but what it really does is alter the back tension. And by increasing the back tension slightly, you are pulling the tape a bit harder against their tape heads, and you can just squeeze a tiny bit more signal out of it that way. Another thing I've often done is if I've got a low magnetic retentivity tape, is just run it through the machine once and then run it a second time and do the capture on that second pass. And sometimes it's just a tiny bit better. You could argue that tape baking is counterproductive because, of course, magnetic retentivity is dependent upon various factors, including heat. So high temperature would tend to erase the tape. But actually, if I've got a sticky shed tape that needs baking, it needs baking, and you'd have to just deal with a low RF output. It probably won't make any difference just putting it in the tape baking process for a few hours. Very long-term storage at high temperature is more likely to erase the tape. Now, I have read an article about a group who modified a pneumatic machine to alter the frequency response, the way the machine worked, and it was able to play tapes with low magnetic retentivity better than the standard machine. Not something I've ever got involved with, but there's a tiny possibility there that something more can be done with a tape which has low magnetic retentivity on pneumatic. Tape damage. Well, as I've mentioned earlier, a tape can be curled up by a defective machine, very often a bad pinch roller, and ruin one edge of the tape. But of course, other tapes just suffer from general wear and tear, and I don't know if you can see on this one that there's a great deal of crinkling going on this tape. So this tape may be slightly stretched, or certainly had a very hard life. This is a very old format called VCR, and a tape that looks like that clearly isn't going to give very good results. How bad it is can vary, and again it can be one that if you give it a couple of passes it might be slightly better the second time. Tapes which have been curled over, especially video 8 tapes where there's a fold right the way along the tape, you might think you could just undo that crease on the tape and flatten it out and it will play, but in practice, it can fold up maybe 100 meters of tape. You can't manually uncurl all that tape and then still expect to get a decent picture out of it at the end anyway. So I'm afraid that tapes that have folded over at one edge, such as on video 8, are lost. I would generally splice that piece of tape out, and if the rest of the tape is not damaged in that way, recover the rest of the material. For VHS or beta, where you may have lost the control pulses, it can be worth trying different machines, because different machines will perhaps have their control head in a slightly different place, or may have slightly different sensitivity to the control signals. So if you have a tape which you just can't set the tracking up on, it's continuously rolling, it's worth trying different makes and models of machine, and that's why I have a fleet of different makes and models for just those sort of tapes that you need to experiment with. Then there are tapes with bad recordings. Sometimes these may be fairly minor problems. For example, if a tape has been copied from another tape, very often the amount of chroma, the amount of colour, increases and you can have excessive chroma, and you can just adjust that on the I have digital time-based correctors, and I can just adjust the color down on that, or maybe do it in the editing process later, reduce the color, get a better picture. But very often we're talking about much more serious recording defects. Now, I mentioned earlier, if you try to record an NTSC recording on a PAL machine or vice versa, you'll just get a scrambled mess, and there's not much you can do about that. Some other recording defects that may be possible to work around, for example, if there's poor sound, that can be a defective hi-fi audio track, and perhaps switch your machine to linear mono, and it may give actually a better, more acceptable result. And you can have problems, for example, at the very top or bottom. Very more frequently, the very bottom of the picture becomes a scrambled mess, or there's a lot of damage at the bottom, or long play recordings that won't track at the bottom. And you can kind of edit around that a little bit using video editing software, perhaps drop the picture a bit, crop the bottom off, give it a bit of a widescreen look. You can finish up with something that looks a little bit more presentable than the original, with lots of gashed noise at the bottom. Other recording defects can benefit from the kind of player you use. For example, with my systems with VHS, I virtually always use Super VHS machines that have a built-in digital time-based corrector, and that can help get rid of a lot of lateral wobble. And strangely enough, I've found that those internal time-based correctors are really good at horizontal stabilization, but not necessarily very good at vertical. And the external time-based correctors I use from most of them are from GTH Electronics. They're very good at stabilizing the frame. So the combination of both can help to stabilize recordings. And those formats, the way you don't have the option of a digital time-based corrector, for example, N1500, N1700, V2000, Betamax, where no machines were ever built with time-based correctors, the external time-based corrector can still make a useful contribution. Some formats you can have a external digital time-based corrector that's really well suited to that machine, in particular U-matic. So I have some expensive digital time-based correctors which are specially designed for use with that format, and as well as being a time-based corrector, they also take the place of the dropout compensator. So you get a digital dropout compensator and what's called a proc amp, which allows you to set up color, for example. I've also found a little workaround for, there's a particular defect on U-matic, it's called ringing, where vertical objects have little faint like ghosts to the right of them. And I found if I set up some of my digital time-based correctors in a particular way, at the expense of some resolution, you can tune out that ringing very slightly, because the filters inside the time-based corrector don't work in the way you might imagine. Filtering is quite a complex subject, and when you turn down the sharpness, you don't just get a reduction in sharpness. It's a complex filter arrangement that you can tune such that that ringing effect is just reduced at certain setting on the sharpness control. And the weird thing is, you reduce the sharpness even lower, the ringing comes back. So it's a case of just getting it in the right sweet spot. And I found that helpful for low-band U-matic tapes, typically low-band U-matic tapes, which have that ringing defect. And the thing is, I've seen U-matic ringing on broadcast TV many, many times. Yeah, I jump up and shout to the missus, "Look, that's been recorded on U-matic." Oh, she's really not interested. But every time I see U-matic ringing on TV, I get quite excited about it. And it was a failing of the format, and it is something that you can slightly improve at playback time. Here's another quite common problem, actually. This is a typical camcorder deck. Now, I've done a video about this defect. What can happen is, this is an 8mm deck. The problem can happen with any format. These guides swing around to the side of the head when it's laced up and set the height of the tape of the input and output portions of the tape path. And if the locking mechanism underneath these guides is not done up properly during the manufacture, these can start to wind themselves clockwise or anti-clockwise and go up or down, and result in the tape being at the wrong height as it goes in and out of the contact with the spinning head drum. That can make a recording that this same machine will play okay, but no other machine will play. So the customer may not realize that they've made recordings that are not in specification and won't play on any other machine. And this problem is particularly acute if long play was used on any format, because then the tape speed is lower, so the precision that the tape path needs to be is higher. So you can get a situation where a defective recorder can play its own recordings and other machines will play its recordings okay, fine in standard play, but in long play the misalignment is too great for the machine to be able to track. So tape guide misalignment is another issue for that can result in bad recordings that can't be played on any normal machine. I do sometimes set a machine up to deliberately try to match the misalignment of the original recording, and that works to a point. Depends how far out it is. If you're out by just a fraction of a millimeter, you can adjust these guides on a player and get perfectly good results. But if it's out a very long way, then very often the recording's completely lost. Well, I hope you've learned something and enjoyed learning a little bit about some of the problems you can get with audio and videotapes, and some of those that you can and can't improve. Please remember to like, share and especially subscribe, and I'll do a lot more content on audio and video technology in the near future. Bye for now.